Happy Star Wars Day, everyone! 49 years ago on this day in 1977, we saw the original release of Star Wars in theaters. It is absolutely crazy to think that was almost 50 years ago. Lucas Wars by Laurent Hopman and illustrated by Renaud Roche tells the story of how George Lucas created Star Wars. You might not think a non-fiction, behind-the-scenes look in the movie creation process would really lead to a compelling narrative, or you might already be all too familiar with the original production and might not think something like this would be worthwhile. But this book is excellent. I would almost want a movie adaptation if I didn't already think it probably is best told as a comic. As I read about all the challenges that George had to face when creating Star Wars, all the hoops he had to jump through, I kept thinking over and over, how the hell did this man get this movie made? But he did, and the rest, as we know, is history. So let's check out Lucas Wars. I know this is strange considering everything in this book actually happened, but spoiler warning from here on out. George Lucas growing up was a rebellious child to the annoyance of his parents. That rebellious streak led George getting into a very serious car accident when he was just a young man. But even before that, his parents and teachers viewed him as idle or lazy. Though he did show initiative and creativity, like when he turned his parents' garage into a haunted house to earn pocket money, he also was very inspired by his heroes Flash Gordon and Tommy Tomorrow. George didn't want what 1960s suburban America had laid out for him. He wanted to be a race car driver. Until his accident made him reconsider his life choices. He now wanted to study film, to the annoyance of his parents. In college, George makes a name for himself through his film Electronic Labyrinth. He meets Steven Spielberg and Marcia Lou Griffin. George is a little awkward to the outgoing Marcia, but he does eventually ask her out, and after some time, they move in together and get married. George works with Francis Ford Coppola on his first feature film, THX 1138. But it's not the big hit that they all wanted. George then creates American Graffiti to better connect with the public on an emotional level. He does have a lot of success, but still has to butt heads with the Hollywood suits. Except for Alan Ladd Jr. at 20th Century Fox. George wants to create something hopeful and fun to contrast with all those gloomy, depressing films that were coming out at the time. He wants to adapt Flash Gordon, but was told that he won't be able to direct. So instead, George writes a synopsis for Star Wars and sends it to the major studios. And they all think it's trash. But Alan Ladd Jr. and Fox give him a shot to write a script. Thankfully, American Graffiti is a big hit, and George and Marcia are now millionaires. George now moves on to Star Wars. He struggled for months to put his ideas on paper, but by the summer of 1974, the first draft was complete, though very different from his original synopsis. Both Marcia and 20th Century Fox tell him to refine the second draft. He has his friends look it over, and they are brutal with their criticism. He hires Gary Kurtz to budget for the film, Ralph McQuarrie to bring his vision to life, Colin Cantwell to build mock-ups of the ships, and Alex Tavularis to put together a storyboard. George is inspired by Joseph Campbell's hero's journey when writing his third script, but still, Fox is leaving George out to dry, forcing him to cover much of the film's cost himself. He plans to film in England, but plans to work on the special effects in California, so he founds his own company to work on it, Industrial Light and Magic. He wants the space battles to feel real, but the type of camera they need to film these complex shots doesn't exist, so they decide to invent it themselves. Ben Burtt is hired to give Star Wars the most memorable sound effects in film history. 20th Century Fox does not give George the required budget for special effects. They don't believe in the project, and just want it to die a slow death. But George is used to being underestimated, and pushes forward. He spends weeks trying to find the right cast for Han, Luke, and Leia. He wants to cast unknowns for the roles, and is very hesitant to use anyone he's previously worked with. Marcia tells him to stop fixating on that when they realize that Harrison Ford is the best fit for Han Solo. and Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill were also hired for their personality. Alan Ladd continues to fight against his higher-ups at Fox to get this movie greenlit, while George deletes scenes to help with the film's budget. George is kept very busy, requesting to see his team's creations for approval. In March 1976, their budget was finally approved less than a week before filming started in Tunisia. But the problems only got worse from there. Anthony Daniels was in a lot of pain from his C-3PO costume. A truck carrying droids caught on fire, and a terrible storm drowns the region in a massive rainfall. An Algerian army patrol even suspected them of transporting weapons near the border. Alec Guinness arrives on set a week later, and he has great chemistry with Mark Hamill. But Anthony Daniels and Kenny Baker can't stand each other. Later, George is struggling what to do with Obi-Wan after they escape from the Death Star. Marcia suggests to have Obi-Wan sacrifice himself, and George agrees that would better serve the story, though Alec Guinness takes the news rather hard. Returning for England for the next part of filming, most of the actors meet for the very first time. George is bound by union filming rules in the UK, and everyone has to be done filming every day by 5:30. George's editors are annoyed by his avant-garde vision of filmmaking and think he is in over his head. While tensions are rising, Alec Guinness dislikes the idea of dying halfway into the film and wants to leave the production altogether. So George has to spend nearly an hour convincing him that killing off Obi-Wan is the right call. By April 20th, Carrie Fisher joins the production, not really enthused with Leia's iconic earmuff hairstyle. She also has to wrap her boobs to keep them from bouncing so much. A bra might have been easier, but there is no underwear in space, according to George. The cast continue to build camaraderie with each other, and vent their troubles with George's awkward dialogue. Harrison even goes as far as changing his lines to sound more natural. On May 14th, the cast and crew throw George a surprise party for his 32nd birthday. Unfortunately, later in the night, some guys attempt to take advantage of an inebriated Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford steps in and rescues her from that situation. And the two of them begin an affair in secret for the rest of the production. Tensions continue to rise further as George cuts ties with his editor and argues with his director of photography. Some special effects shots don't end up working, and Mark Hamill burst a blood vessel in his eye, so they can't do close-up shots of him for a few days. By June, filming of Star Wars started to wrap up, and Carrie and Harrison chose to mutually end their adulterous relationship. In August, back at ILM, they are up to their necks in deep crap. There are 360 special effects shots that need to be shot in the next 7 months, and they have to edit the whole movie from scratch. And the stress from production catches up to George, who suffered from extreme hypertension and believed he was having a heart attack. Alan Ladd once again puts his neck on the line for one more bluff against the Fox Board of Directors. George and Carrie Kurtz hired George Mather to whip ILM into shape and get them working on all cylinders for the next 8 months. George, along with his wife, Paul Hirsch, and Richard Shue edit the film, and the true movie finally takes shape. George's lawyer Tom Pollock finally arranged a contract with Fox that gave George everything he asked for, including 50% of the rights on merchandising. George wants to release the movie on May 25th, so that kids will watch the movie and then talk about it with their friends at school, just before summer break. At the recommendation of Steven Spielberg, George hires John Williams to compose the movie, but only has a very limited amount of time before the May release date. However, even more bad news from Alan. Fox still doesn't believe in Star Wars, and they're only putting it in 32 theaters. George works day and night juggling the editing, the special effects, the marketing, and the dubbing. James Earl Jones is hired to do the voice of Darth Vader. George and Marcia work on the climax of the film, retouching it literally the night before the theatrical release. On the 25th, George and Marcia just happen to be walking in Los Angeles when they notice that Mann's Chinese Theater was actually playing Star Wars. In fact, all the theaters playing Star Wars were breaking records. As he and Marcia take a vacation in Hawaii, George can barely believe the world's reaction to Star Wars. It doesn't seem real to him, or he thinks it'll die off soon. But just as Spielberg predicted, Star Wars became the biggest success in the history of movies. Alan Ladd Jr. gets to clap back at the board of directors who didn't sign a contract with George for years, but now suddenly want to renegotiate the contract after the movie is a hit. George, who never really cared about money, shares a percentage of the revenue with those who made it possible. Ready to negotiate a sequel with the board of directors, George's new contract involved receiving 80% of the revenue, 100% of the merchandising rights to the sequels, and total artistic control. And Mr. Hamill even received a sample of every Star Wars product according to the terms of his contract. Laurent Hopman cites his sources with a bibliography in the back, and we also see some of Renaud's sketches. I love the art of this book. Everyone is immediately identifiable. The storytelling is great too. It's an honest-to-God, underdog story that anyone can identify with, even if they're not fans of Star Wars. Side note, I'm so glad the story didn't end with a fast forward to the future of George Lucas passing the torch to Disney. Like, no one wants to see that. But this book does have a sequel that covers Empire Strikes Back and Indiana Jones. If that ever gets an English version, I'll definitely review that one too. Have a great Star Wars Day, everyone.